Wyoming Territory, June 1879. The wind whistled low across the dry grass as Rowan McAllister stepped into the shade of the livery barn, his boots scuffing dust off the hard-packed ground. The heat had settled in early that year, and his shirt clung to his back beneath his duster. He tugged his hat lower, trying not to think about the ache in his shoulder from the bullet that never quite healed right. He had come for a horse. That was it. Nothing more. He paused at the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the dim. The smell of hay and sweat, leather and manure filled the space. A chestnut gelding shifted in the first stall, ears twitching. Rowan passed it without a glance. His gaze moved to the far end where the light angled through the slats just right, glinting off something pale in the shadows. Then the hay rustled. Rowan stopped, hand brushing the butt of his Colt. A soft sound like a breath being held too long came from the third stall. He stepped forward. The mare inside snorted and backed away, revealing the shape behind her. A woman. Curled into the straw, arms wrapped around her knees, her face streaked with dust and tears. She wore a pale blue dress, torn at the hem, and her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins. She looked up. Her eyes were wide, green, and full of fear. "Please," she whispered. "Do not tell them I am here." Rowan stared at her. 1,000 questions came to mind, but he kept his voice low, steady. "Who are you?" I should not have run," she said. "But I did. I could not marry him. Not after what he did." He crouched beside the stall door, gaze sharp. "Marry who?" "Sheriff McNary," she said, voice cracking. "He tried to force me. Said no one would care what happened to a woman with no family left. I had nowhere else to go." Rowan cursed under his breath. He had dealt with McNary before. Slick smile, cold eyes. The man had too much power and not enough conscience. The woman's breath hitched. "Please," she said again. "I will leave. Tonight. Just let me rest until dark." Rowan hesitated. He had not come here for this. He had come to buy a horse and ride north, far from the mess of his past. But something about her, something in the way she sat so still, like a bird too tired to fly, held him there. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara," she said. "Clara Lorne." His jaw tightened. "You got anyone looking out for you?" She shook her head. He looked away, jaw flexing. Damn it. He did not want to care. But the truth was, he did. "I am not leaving you here," he muttered. Clara blinked. "Why?" "Because you are hiding in a horse stall," Rowan said, standing. "And no woman should have to run from her own wedding." She stared at him, confused. "Who are you?" "Rowan McAllister," he said. "I was just here for a horse." A faint, broken laugh left her. "So much for that." He stepped back and opened the stall door. "Come on." Clara hesitated. "Where would I even go?" Rowan rubbed the back of his neck. "I have a cabin. 2 days' ride. It is quiet. No one around for miles." Clara stood slowly, brushing straw from her dress. She looked like she might fall over. "I can pay," she said. "I had some money hidden in my shoe." I do not want your money," Rowan said, cutting her off. "You can stay until you figure out what comes next." She nodded, eyes wide. "Thank you." Rowan led her out the back of the barn, avoiding the main street. He saddled the bay mare he had come to see and helped Clara up behind him. She held on tight, her hands clutching his coat, and they rode hard into the hills before the sun fell. By nightfall, they had made camp near a creek. Clara sat by the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees again. She had barely spoken since they left. Rowan handed her a tin cup of coffee and sat across from her. The flames crackled between them. "You were going to marry him?" he asked finally. Clara nodded slowly. "After my uncle died last month, there was no one left. I was staying at the boarding house. Sheriff McNary came calling. Said I was pretty enough and quiet enough to be a good wife. When I said no, he made it clear I would not be safe if I stayed." Rowan looked into the fire. "You were right to run." She glanced at him, her voice soft. "Why are you helping me?" He met her eyes. "Because someone should." She smiled, small and tired. You do not seem like the helping kind. He did not answer that. They rode again at dawn, slow and quiet through the hills. Clara asked few questions and Rowan offered fewer answers. But he noticed the way she sat straighter in the saddle each day, the way her eyes seemed less haunted when she looked around. She had a quiet strength, the kind that built over time. By the second night, she was making the fire herself. By the third, she was laughing just once, when the horse tried to eat her shawl, but it was real. On the fourth day, they reached his cabin. It was small, set against the trees with a wide porch and a stone chimney. Clara stared at it for a long moment before dismounting. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is quiet," Rowan replied. Inside, he lit the lantern while she stood in the doorway. "You built this?" "Every board." She stepped inside. "It feels like a place someone could live." "Really live?" He glanced at her. "You can stay as long as you need." Clara turned to him. "And if I wanted to stay for more than that?" Rowan froze. She stepped closer. "I know I just met you. I know I was scared and you saved me. But out there riding with you, I felt safe. Like I could breathe again." Rowan looked down. "I am not the kind of man you build a life with." "Why not?" "I have seen too much. Done too much. I do not talk much. I do not smile much. Hell, I barely sleep." Clara reached out, her hand brushing his. "I do not need you to smile, Rowan. I just need you to stay." He looked at her, really looked. Her eyes were steady, her hand warm in his. He wrapped his fingers around hers. "I was just here for a horse," he said quietly. She smiled, tears in her eyes. "And you found me instead." And for the first time in a long while, Rowan smiled back. Rowan stepped into the morning light, the cabin door swinging shut behind him with a soft creak. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, but the eastern sky was turning the color of bruised peaches. He crossed the packed dirt yard toward the shed, the axe handle balanced against his shoulder. Behind him, a flicker of movement in the window told him Clara was already awake. She hadn't asked for much since they'd arrived. She'd taken to the space like it had been waiting for her, clearing shelves, oiling the hinges, stitching a curtain from an old scrap of muslin she'd found folded beneath the cot. She moved quietly, but with purpose, as if the act of making order gave her something to hold on to. Rowan set to work, splitting logs into halves with measured effort. The rhythm steadied his thoughts. He liked the way the cold air clung to the sweat on his neck, the way the silence out here left room for things to settle in his chest. By the time he'd stacked the last split log, the door creaked again. Clara stepped outside, holding his old tin coffee pot by the handle with a folded cloth. She wore the same dress she'd arrived in, but she'd washed it and mended the tear near the hem with a neat line of stitching. "I didn't want to bother you," she said, setting the pot on the stump near his feet. "But I thought you might want something warm." He nodded once. "Thanks." She didn't go back inside. Instead, she looked past the trees toward the slope where the scrub gave way to open grass. "You've lived here long?" He poured the coffee into a cup. 6 years. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, eyes still on the horizon. "I don't know what 6 years of anything feels like." He drank slowly, the steam curling past his cheek. "You don't have to tell me anything." "I know," she said, "but I want to." He waited. "I was born in Kansas," she began, her voice steady, "on a farm that never once turned a good crop. My mother died young. I barely remember her face, only that she sang while she worked. My father, he wasn't cruel, just tired. He drank more than he talked." Rowan said nothing. She didn't seem to need prompting. "When I was 15, my uncle came for me. Said I'd do better with his family in Laramie. I worked in his wife's dry goods store. Thought maybe I'd marry the blacksmith's apprentice. He was sweet, but he took sick that winter and passed before anything came of it." She brushed a hand over her sleeve, eyes lowered. "After that, things just folded in. My uncle died of a stroke last month. His wife went back east to her sister. There wasn't any place left that was mine." Rowan studied her, the way her shoulders pulled in slightly when she spoke, like she was bracing against a storm that hadn't passed yet. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" he asked. Clara's eyes lifted to his. "I did, once. But the thought of starting over in some place where I'd be nothing but a face in a crowd. It didn't feel like hope. It felt like vanishing." He set the coffee down and leaned against the shed wall. "You're not invisible here." Her throat worked around the words she didn't speak. "I thought I'd be alone in this place," he went on. "That I'd earned that." Clara stepped closer, her hands tucked in front of her. "What did you do, Rowan?" His jaw tightened. "I fought for the Union. Then I hunted men who didn't want to see the war end. I saw things up close no man should get used to. After that I quit riding with anyone. Made my way out here." Clara didn't flinch. "You still carry it?" "Some days it's quieter." He met her gaze. "Some days it ain't." She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't scare easy." He let out a slow breath. "No, I don't reckon you do." Back inside, she boiled oats for breakfast while he cleaned the traps he'd brought in from the ridge. They worked without words for a while, the quiet between them easy now. When she handed him a bowl, their fingers touched and neither pulled away first. That evening, she stood on the porch with her hands resting lightly against the railing, watching the last of the light drain behind the hills. Rowan joined her, a blanket draped over one arm. "You cold?" he asked. She nodded once. He stepped behind her and draped the wool over her shoulders. Clara tilted her head back slightly. "You ever think about letting someone stay?" He looked past the trees, his voice low. "I never thought someone might want to." She turned to face him, close now. "I do." Rowan's breath caught, his hands loose at his sides. Her expression didn't waver. He reached up slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You're sure?" "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't." His hand lowered, resting against her waist. "Then stay, Clara. Stay as long as you'll have me." She leaned into him and he held her like he'd never held anything so carefully before. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, throwing soft light across the wood-planked floor. He didn't need to say anything else. She already knew. The river ran high, that spring snowmelt coming fast out of the mountains, and the sound of it filled the air as Rowan checked the fencing along the north pasture. Clara walked behind him, her skirt gathered at the knees and pinned with a bit of twine she'd found in the shed. He hadn't asked her to come, but she'd risen just after dawn and pulled on his spare boots without a word. They moved in step, the space between them narrowing as the land opened wide. "You always keep cattle?" she asked, eyeing the small herd that grazed near the cottonwoods. "Just enough to trade for flour and coffee come fall," he said, crouching to tighten a post. "Too many and I'd have to hire help." She knelt beside him, her hand steadying the wire as he twisted it with the fencing pliers. "And you don't trust folks easy." He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. They kept on down the line, silence stretching comfortable between them. When they reached the southern edge of the pasture, Clara leaned against the fence and looked out over the meadow. The wind stirred her hair, lifting it from her neck. Rowan watched her from the corner of his eye, the way she squinted into the distance like she was reading something only she could see. "I used to draw maps," she said suddenly. He glanced at her. "Maps? When I was a girl. Made up places. Rivers that led to cities of stone, forests with trees taller than steeples. I'd spend hours lying on the floor with a pencil and scrap paper from the store." He rested his forearms on the top rail. "You still draw?" She shrugged. "Not since I left Kansas." "I didn't think it mattered anymore." He looked out at the hills, the shadows shifting over them as clouds passed. "Maybe it does." Clara's lips parted, but whatever she might have said was lost to the call of a hawk overhead. Her gaze followed it until it disappeared beyond the ridge. They made their way back toward the cabin as the sun climbed higher, the air warming enough to make the fabric of her dress stick to her spine. At the bottom of the slope, she paused by a low patch of wild sage and knelt, fingers brushing the leaves. "I could make tea with this," she murmured. "If you've got a kettle that isn't rusted through." "Top shelf in the pantry," he said. She smiled, not the tired kind she'd carried when she first arrived, but something heartier, like green shoots pushing up through dry ground. Inside, she boiled the water while Rowan ran a whetstone down the length of his hunting knife. The rhythmic rasp of metal on stone filled the quiet. "I want to earn my place here," she said. Rowan didn't look up. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said, setting 2 cups on the table. "But I want to build something that's mine too. Not just hide from what came before." He set the knife aside. "What would that look like?" "I could plant a garden," she said. "Maybe keep hens. We could trade eggs in town if it's safe enough." He leaned back, arms crossed over his chest. "It's your choice. But I'd be there if you went." Her gaze met his across the table. "Would you call me your wife if someone asked?" He didn't answer right away. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and outside, the wind rustled through the pines. "I would," he said at last, "if you wanted that." "I do," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. That night, they sat on the porch with a blanket over both their knees, watching the stars come out one by one. Clara rested her head on Rowan's shoulder, her hand tucked into his. He could feel the weight of her against him, the solidness of her choice. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting for the world to take something else from him. He felt like a man who'd finally been given something back. The rain had come in the night, soft at first, then steady enough to drum against the cabin roof like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Morning brought a gray sky and the scent of damp pine, the kind of weather that made the world feel quieter somehow closer. Rowan stood at the edge of the porch, coat collar turned up, watching the mist rise off the slope where his tools leaned in a tidy line against the shed wall. Clara moved behind him, sweeping ash from the hearth and setting a clean pot over the coals. She hadn't spoken yet, neither of them had, but the silence didn't carry weight. It simply was. When she stepped outside, the door clicked shut behind her. She held a tin box in her hands, its corners worn smooth. "I found this in the trunk you keep under the cot," she said. "I didn't go looking. It was just there when I cleared out the blankets." Rowan didn't turn. "You opened it?" "I did." He nodded once, slow. "I saw the metal," she continued. "And the letter. From someone named Josiah." Rowan shifted, his boots creaking on the boards. "He was my brother." Clara lowered herself onto the porch rail, the box resting in her lap. "He wrote like he thought you'd be back by winter. He never made it through autumn." She didn't speak for a moment. "You never told me you had family." "I don't." The rain softened, a hush falling over the trees. "He died at Cold Harbor," Rowan said finally. "I was 2 ridges north, pinned down with a busted leg and a rifle that jammed every 3rd shot. By the time I got to where he'd been, there wasn't much left to carry." Clara's hand rested lightly on the box. "You kept the letter." "I didn't have much else." She traced the edge with her thumb. "He sounded proud of you." Rowan let out a breath through his nose. "He shouldn't have been." Clara stood and stepped to his side. "You lived. That's worth something." He met her gaze, and for a moment, the years between that war and this porch narrowed into something sharp and fragile. She slid her arm through his, resting her head against his shoulder. "I'd like to write him back." Rowan looked down at her. "He's gone." "I know," she said. "But maybe you need to say something you never did." "Maybe I do too." That evening, she sat at the table with a candle burning low and a folded sheet of paper before her. Rowan watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, the weight in his chest shifting in ways he hadn't expected. Clara dipped the pen and began to write, her brow furrowed in thought. "I never had anyone to write to," she said without looking up. "But I always imagined I would someday." "You do now," he said. She smiled, faint but certain. The next morning, the sun broke through, silver light cutting across the floorboards. Clara stepped outside with a basket on her hip, her boots dark with dew. Rowan followed her to the edge of the clearing, where the soil turned rich and dark near the tree line. "I want to plant here," she said. "Greens, maybe a few rows of carrots." I'll trade with the woman who keeps the goats down near Bitter Creek, she said. She's got seed potatoes if we bring her eggs. Rowan crouched beside her, running a handful of earth through his fingers. You already made friends? She came by while you were checking the trapline last week. Left a jar of pickled onions and said she liked my tea. He chuckled, quiet and unexpected. You're building something. Clara pressed a small flag of fabric into the ground to mark the row. We are. That night, with her hands still streaked with dirt and her hair braided low, she stood by the hearth while Rowan stoked the fire. When he rose, she caught his hand. I want to marry you, she said. He didn't answer right away, only studied her face as if committing every line to memory. I don't have much to give, he said. You already gave it, she replied. He nodded once, then again, and she saw it settle in him, like a root finally catching hold. We'll ride to the preacher next week, he said. Bring something from the garden to thank him. Clara blinked back sudden tears and laughed instead, soft and sure. He can have the first carrots. I'll make do with the second. Rowan leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. You're not hiding anymore. No, she whispered. I'm home. The wagon creaked over the rutted path, its wheels grinding softly as Rowan guided it toward the small whitewashed church nestled in a bend of the Piney Creek Valley. Clara sat beside him, her gloved hands folded in her lap, a faint flush warming her cheeks just above the collar of her borrowed shawl. The fabric had once belonged to Rowan's mother. He hadn't mentioned that. He just laid it across Clara's shoulders that morning before they left. They hadn't spoken much on the ride. There was no need to. The quiet between them had taken root in a new way, not from caution or grief, but from something settled and shared. As they passed a stand of poplar trees, Clara shifted slightly on the bench. Do you think he'll ask questions? Rowan kept his eyes on the narrowing path. Probably. She nodded. I'm not sure what I'll say. Tell the truth, you want to marry a man who still cuts fence posts by hand and talks more to his horse than anyone else. Clara gave a soft huff, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. You do talk to her more than me some days. She listens better, he said, glancing at her with a sideways flick of his eyes. Clara pretended to inspect the sky, but her smile was unmistakable. The church came into view just after midday, its steeple modest, the paint along its clapboard walls faded where the sun hit hardest. A single buckboard was tied out front. Rowan set the brake, then stepped down and offered a hand. Clara took it without hesitation, her grip firm despite the tremble in her fingers. Inside, the air was cool and still. A wasp drifted near the window but made no sound. The wooden pews stood empty, polished by time and solitude. A man in a gray coat came out from a side room, wiping his hands on a cloth. Reverend Tilby? Rowan asked. I am. You the ones from west of the ridge? Rowan nodded. We are. The Reverend's eyes moved between them, not unkindly. You've brought witnesses? No, Clara said, stepping forward. Just each other. The Reverend studied her for a moment. You look steady enough. I am. He gestured toward the altar. Then let's do it simple. They stood facing each other, the only sound the wind brushing against the windows and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath their boots. Clara's hands didn't shake when Rowan took them. She looked up at him, her eyes clear. Do you come of your own will? The Reverend asked, voice low. Rowan nodded. Yes. And you, miss? I do, Clara said, without a flicker of hesitation. There were no rings, no vows memorized. Just the words spoken between them and the Reverend's nod as he said, then you are husband and wife before God and this land. Outside, the pale sun had crept from behind the clouds. Rowan helped Clara into the wagon once more, but this time she slid closer to him, her hand resting on his thigh as they began the slow ride home. They stopped once by a stretch of wildflowers just beginning to bloom along a shallow bend in the creek. Clara climbed down to gather a few, tucking them into the folds of her shawl. When she returned, Rowan touched her face with calloused fingers and leaned in, his kiss unhurried and sure. She curled into him, the flowers cradled between them forgotten. That night they shared a supper of cornmeal biscuits and rabbit stew. Clara lit a single candle on the table and Rowan poured 2 cups of cider from the bottle he'd stowed beneath the floorboards years ago, waiting for something worth marking. They didn't speak much over the meal. But afterward, in the quiet of the cabin, Rowan reached for Clara's hand and led her to the side room he'd been working on in secret since the day she said she wanted to stay. The walls were new pine, the window framed with muslin curtains she hadn't noticed missing from the storage trunk. A small writing desk stood beneath the window and beside it a wooden chest with a folded blanket on top. Clara turned slowly, her hand to her mouth. "I thought you might want your own space," Rowan said. "To draw. Or whatever you need." She stepped forward, running her fingers along the edge of the desk. "You made this?" He nodded. "Took a while?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I don't need my own space," she said. "I just needed someone to believe I could have one." Rowan crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. Her cheek pressed against his chest, and they stood like that until the candle in the other room burned low. That spring, Clara filled the garden rows with sprouting greens and bright marigolds to keep the beetles off the beans. Rowan built a henhouse beneath the lean-to, and every morning, Clara collected eggs in the apron she'd sewn from a piece of calico the trader's wife gave her in exchange for a jar of sage tea. They made trips to town twice that summer. No one asked any questions, and no one turned them away. Clara traded preserves for cloth and ink. Rowan sold a steer and came home with a new kettle and a length of ribbon he never explained. One evening in early July, Clara brought out a folded sheet of paper and laid it on Rowan's lap. A map. Drawn in clean lines, with the creek, the pasture, the church, and the trail cut through the pines. At the corner, she'd penned a single word. "Home." Rowan stared at it, then at her. "You're still drawing." "I'm still building," she said. He stood and pulled her into his arms, his voice rough against her hair. "We both are." The years that followed weren't without work or weather or worry. But they were full. Clara's garden grew. Rowan's fences held. And every evening they sat on the porch together, her hand in his, the hills turning gold before them. When the first frost came, Rowan carved her name beside his in the beam above the cabin door. Not as a claim, but as a promise. And in that quiet life they built among pine and creek and earth, they lived and loved with the kind of peace that doesn't come fast, but stays.